Talk Transformation podcasts. In today's episode, we will be discussing the future of learning and how to create more impactful and meaningful learning experiences. I'm delighted to welcome Michelle Parry-Slater, founder and director of Kairos Modern Learning. Michelle, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. What a joy to speak to you.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. Michelle, you specialize in enabling that shift, I'm going to put it that way, from traditional learning to more digital, social, sort of face-to-face workplace learning, which is the quest we share.
Yeah.
To enable the most impactful, innovative, meaningful learning experiences, which is what brought us together, in that serendipitous way that the universe does. But I know you also host your own podcast, Learning from the Edges. I love that title because we all know that innovation comes from the edges of systems, and that's where the wisdom happens. You've also authored the L&D Practitioners Toolkit, and I know you're currently in the middle of writing another book on easing workplace friction, which will be out later this year, I think. We'll come to that later. But in your own words, you are an author, strategic practitioner, and leader. And I love the fact that it's also about practitioning. So can you tell us what drove you to set up your consultancy, Kairos Modern Learning, and why practitioning more explicitly?
They're really interesting questions. Thank you for the nice intro. The consultancy was born out of fear. In
What a
truth.
great result. Great example of
Um,
step over your fear.
I am just between jobs, is how I described it. My former director, Catherine Marlowe, who I will give a shout out to, because she really did encourage me. We implemented the first video-based learning platform in a global organization. And it was hugely successful because people could talk to people.
Yeah.
And I really value peer learning because that's where it happens.
Yeah.
That's the truth of the matter is people talk to other people, and that's how your culture spreads in your organization. That's how we do things around here spreads in your organization. And as a consequence of it, I ended up on the speaker circuits sharing our story. And Catherine really encouraged me. She said, "You have a business here. People are asking you to help them to bring that sort of the theoretical side of how do we do learning differently, the social, the digital, the blending of stuff. But also, you are a practitioner, Michelle. You do this. You've done this job for a long time. So that's really where the consultancy was born out of. And I say fear because how could anybody in their right mind walk away from a well-paid job that you really enjoyed with fantastic people who I'm still in touch with 10 years later to work for yourself when you've got 3 children and 2 dogs and your parents that you look after? So it was fear. But I said to Catherine, I said, look, I'll just do that until I get another job. So I'm just between jobs. That's all.
Oh, wow. And that was 10 years ago.
Yeah.
It is, but what you say is really scary. And it's just, for me, it epitomizes what we're all living, which is going from the known, the certain, the safe to something more uncertain, more unknown. And fortunately or unfortunately, that's the way the world is turning, isn't it? In terms of, you know, how interconnected we are, how much we can predict, how much we can't predict. And we're really in the complexity of systems and, the planet and society as a system. And I think, when I stepped out of the organization I used to work in, it was scary. Now I look back, but at the time I was just like, I'm just going to do it and we'll just see what happens. And I think that's really interesting, particularly now for learning, because learning has evolved so much, hasn't it, over the last 5 or 6 years, and COVID has massively accelerated the digital element. We used to call digital learning e-learning. That was it. Tick.
Yeah.
Digital
Yeah.
learning is it's on a screen and it's e-learning and you don't necessarily interact, etc., etc. So how have you seen learning evolve, Michelle, over the past 5 years, particularly after COVID?
It's really helped me and my mission because I think you're right. A lot of people did see digital learning as equal e-learning.
Mm.
And some of those founding fathers of e-learning, they're almost now apologizing for what they created, which was sort of click, 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 quiz at the end. Hooray! You've done some learning. And there's very little interactivity. It's very passive as an
Mm.
activity, which is not good. It's not good brain science
Yeah.
to help you to remember that information.
Mm.
And what we've had with COVID is we've had an acceleration of the opportunity to demonstrate that digital in all its form works.
Mm.
So, of course, people, not all people, but some people had to start working from home in March 2020. And suddenly, what was a communication tool, for example, Zoom, became a learning tool, and we needed to learn differently. Now, fortunately, I was a little bit ahead of the curve there because
Yeah.
I'd been teaching how to use live online classroom for a number of years. I'd written a program with the most marvelous Andy Lancaster, formerly at CIPD, now gone out on his own, taken the fear.
In between jobs.
Exactly. Well, we'd written a program how to write and deliver successful webinars, and that went crazy in COVID. We
Of
delivered
course.
that to so many people. And some of the motivation for me was reach and accessibility. And of course, countries that have this type of problem, geographical boundaries and that kind of thing. So I'm thinking places like Australia or Africa, large expanses of land. Suddenly we've got tools now that formerly were there, but people didn't acknowledge or use. But they've done remote working so well, remote learning so well in Australia, for example, for so long. They've had, school on the radio
Yeah,
for
wow.
ages, for years and
Yeah.
years. We weren't tapping into these sorts of resources. But what COVID did was say, we can do work differently. The system we had didn't necessarily serve the people or the purpose that we actually need to achieve. So I've loved it. I mean, this is terrible. It was a terrible, terrible tragedy, and so many people lost their lives. But from a learning perspective, all had to immerse ourselves into a new environment, a new way of thinking, way of learning. And the system has changed forever.
I was going to say there's no going back, is there? Because even if we take a couple of steps back, you're still in this hybrid model, which will never be sitting in a classroom passively learning. As you know, I spent quite a lot of my education like that, as I'm sure a lot of people did,
Well,
particularly of my
so many did.
generation.
What I found really interesting was, I mean, I had two children in school. I had a daughter doing A levels. That's the sort of the final years of school in the UK. And the teachers didn't know how to teach
Yeah,
online. They
yeah,
didn't know how to, one of the teachers, and good or bad, retired during COVID and that pandemic whilst they're away. But he would say to the kids, read chapter 8 in the book. And that was
yes,
their lesson.
yes.
And they're teaching themselves A-level maths, A-level physics, really
Wow.
complex things. And they just didn't have the skills. So I think that skills uplift as a result of COVID has been a massive benefit, that people who were previously just in-person practitioners have now actually garnered new skills, or like him, retired.
Because it's a whole, I was going to say, it's a whole different skill set, isn't it? Because it's not just about contents. I remember discussing with one of my clients here that they wanted to just put everything they had on a platform and just duplicate the contents.
Yeah.
But the whole notion of user journey, but how would I do that? How would I learn that? How would it be the most intuitive? Was
Yeah.
really, really alien to them, Michelle. And they were like, we don't need to look at that.
Yeah. The
Let's just
lift
take what we've got. Like,
lift and shift brigade they were just, let's take everything face to face. But it's different in this environment. I mean, you're obviously in France and I'm in England, and it's about digital body language. It's
yeah,
about reading the room, but
yes,
reading the room differently. And if you've got 20 people in a room together like this, how do you see people? And this is what face-to-face practitioners struggle with, but you see them in a different way. You look out for them, you look for their names in the chat.
yeah.
You offer for a whiteboard, and you can comments colors there, and so opportunity for us to just shift a little bit in the way that we think about things. And so digital body language is a skill that we can learn and we can use, and that's the sort of thing that's accelerated as a result of COVID.
And what other trends do you see coming into learning? Because I think if I look at it from a practitioner perspective, as a facilitator and also as a coach, I mean, it's revolutionized the world of coaching as well. And now we've got generative AI on top of that, the big discussion around, can AI replace coaching? Well, my school of thought on that is it can't translate where the magic happens, which is the silence yet. But, it's a whole different skill set, isn't it? So, do you think that that should be something that teachers should also be trained in?
Oh, yes, 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 absolutely. I mean, again, it's the lift and shift brigade,
Yeah.
because what's happening with generative AI is brilliant. We can create courses faster.
Yes.
Well, just you're just losing the opportunity of something like generative AI
Mm,
to be able to do so much more. And I think that as a trend, it's like a lot of the trends over the years with learning. I mean, we went to mobile learning, for
mm,
example. That was a bit of a trend for a while. It is never about one-stop shops. It's never about the one solution.
mm.
But it is about embracing that within your own context. So I think that to your point about can teachers use Gen AI or can teachers jump on the trends, what teachers need to look at is actually what's the future of work, because we need to teach in order the skills in order for people to enter the workforce. Unfortunately, and I don't know how it is in a lot of other countries, but certainly in the UK, the exam system doesn't teach for future skills
Same
at
here.
all.
Mm. No.
Doesn't teach for future skills. It teaches to remember by rote, something none of
Yeah.
us need ever to do again. And we
Mm,
haven't needed to do since we've had a smartphone in our pocket with Google on it. And so I think the education system definitely needs to shift and look at the future of work, because
mm.
that's really where it starts. So we've got people coming into the workplace who are not prepared for what work is, but
Yes.
what they are prepared with as a result of their current experience, teaching themselves during COVID, the social isolation of COVID, they're
Mm.
prepared to stand up and say, this isn't good enough. And I'm very buoyed by young people and
Yes.
their ability to actually question work and question why do we do the things we do, because it's not just on the education system, it's actually on us as people in work, the oldies, look at doing things differently. So we might look, in our, I don't know, 50s, like I am, and look at AI and say, well, it's not really going to affect me. And I actually saw this at a conference last year of face-to-face trainers, the Business of Training conference. And it was a great event, really fantastic speakers, really, really well curated event. And all of the room were face-to-face trainers. Half of them said, fantastic, bring it on, show me how I can use AI in my work. How can I blend and augment my face-to-face work with digital?
Mm.
Others literally buried their head in the sand and said, this is never going to affect my job. And it felt like watching farriers back in the day when they invented the motor car.
Yeah.
Oh, it's all about the horse. It's all about the horse. My job's safe. Is it? And I
Mm.
need to, we need to embrace the new trends as much as, we look at the education system for looking at the future of work. But one trend, and I feel like I've gone on a little bit of a monologue, you've caught me on a mission, but one trend that I am seeing, and it's too small in my opinion, and I want to give it amplification, is accessibility.
Yeah.
And I think this is where digital will come into its own. Digital can really help with accessibility and the augmentation between a face-to-face environment plus, things like closed captions, live
Yes.
closed captions. They're not brilliant yet, but AI is helping with that sort of technology advancement,
Mm.
and really do, for personalization's sake, for people who need support, um, for people in a foreign language, for
Yes.
example,
Yeah. Yeah.
in translations, then accessibility is certainly a trend that I want to see bigger than it is at the moment.
Absolutely. It makes learning more inclusive, doesn't it? Which it allows for people to learn differently and to learn in different places and to learn where they are, when they want, and in a way that's meaningful for them. I mean, if I come back to, because it's what we're working with in organizations now is the result of countries' education systems, and business
Mm.
schools for me are continuing to
Yes, they are.
help executives start to think differently, but they're still giving them tools for an ordered world. If I take Dave Snowden's discussion, and our world isn't ordered, it's complex. And I think if you just give them more tools to do what the status quo is already doing, you're just creating more frustration. And I know you practitioner a lot in organizations. So we are at that level of with adults of trying to get them from knowing to learning, which is probably very uncomfortable for them because they've been in the knowing paradigm since year dot. Um, what do you think is the biggest challenge that, or what do you see as the biggest challenge for leaders in organizations that are trying to pioneer and create this culture of learning? And I use the word pioneer, Michelle, because I think it's a lonely place today, but it's definitely worth doing, but it can feel quite lonely.
I think it's about the ability to be vulnerable
Yeah.
and to demonstrate your own learning.
Mm.
We've gone from an environment where even within knowledge work, what you know is your power.
Yeah.
And to give away your knowledge is to give away your power. And I think we're still, with some organizations, shifting away from that knowledge is power approach.
Mm.
Actually, what's proven to be true, people like Julian Stodd, for example, have done research on this. What's proven to be true is when you socialize your power, when you share and change your power, that is definitely when you get more kudos.
Mm.
So I think that helping people to feel vulnerable, helping people to learn themselves and show they're working out loud, will actually start to engender the approach that learning is part of the way we do things around here, otherwise known as learning culture. I think that people really ultimately they care about what they're paid to care about at work, and learning is so unpopular because it's not a KPI. It's not, I don't get more money for it, I don't get a bonus for it. And let's take compliance, for example. I'm on a bit of beef at the moment about compliance learning, because compliance is something that everybody has to do to keep us safe and healthy and legal. Yet the learning departments put out, often outsourced, often not relevant to the organization or the individuals in the organization, they'll put out e-learning. Let's go back to what we originally started this conversation about. And so actually it's our shop window. We should be putting the best learning out there for our compliance, because everybody is accessing it. Yeah. And therefore everyone's impression of learning goes back to that default setting of, oh, it's click next, quiz at the end, I got 8 out of 10, hurrah, I'm legal for another year.
Yes.
Well, actually, we've got the opportunity to really put something good out there that gets people talking, that helps people to tap into that vulnerability, that emotion.
Yeah.
Imagine if we were sharing stories of safety or stories of unsafe practice in our organization and the consequence of that. Then I just think we need to get better at putting better compliance out there, and therefore it will start to generate learning is something that's useful for everyone.
But it's ironic, isn't it, that the reason they're probably not is because it's those courageous conversations that are difficult to have. And if DE and I feel very strongly about inclusion, equity, and the understanding of diversity, equity, and inclusion as a foundational block to innovation, performance, collaboration, competitive advantage. I mean, it's basic understanding for human relationships, and it's often the same. It's a tick box thing of D&I, and the objective is you have to have done the e-learning every year by end of October, and it's just like, oh, I've got to do that DEI thing. Okay, I'll listen to it while I'm doing this. Tick, tick, tick. And I think it's the same. It's because it's those messy, complex, quite hard discussions that can come from sharing lived experiences in quite a vulnerable way. And I don't know how we leverage that, because if I come back to one of your earlier points around the younger generation, there are generational shifts in the workplace as well as in learning. And I think that's a massive, massive opportunity. But you've got to have pretty bold leaders to pick it up and go, this is a huge opportunity for us, everyone. How about, we start talking differently around these subjects. We start, valuing them differently and putting them up at the top with, strategic business objectives. That's basically taking on the whole of the top table, isn't it? So it's really interesting how you see that playing out in your clients, but also in your research.
I think that a really good way of doing it is reverse mentoring. It does two things. It gives, and just for context, reverse mentoring being a younger person mentoring an older person, or a less experienced person mentoring a more experienced person is a favored way of looking at that, because the age is somewhat irrelevant, because people switch careers, they switch jobs, they switch into different settings, and therefore may have less experience in that setting, but more experience in life in other ways. Anyhow, I digress. The reason why it's useful is because it shows that vulnerability as well. It shows that sort of top table saying, well, look, I've got somebody in, who's just started work, and we're having regular conversations every month or every couple of weeks. And I'm learning, and this is what I'm learning. And if they can talk about that more openly, it just creates learning as a very normal way of being. I mean, my ideal nirvana is that every single person in an organization has a learning KPI, even if it's 10%, and managers' responsibility is to ensure, well, what are we learning this week? But there are really easy things that you can do. Mind Tools podcast, which is one that I really like as well,
Yeah.
they always have at the end, what did I learn this week? And that's something that managers can put into their team meetings. If you're meeting people, what have you learned this week? And often we're learning from mistakes. And that's why we don't talk about it. Because
Exactly.
that's a vulnerability, isn't it? To say
Yeah.
out loud, oh, I really, really messed up.
Yeah.
And this is actually what I've learned. I don't want to feel that way again. I don't
Mm.
want the customer to be shouting at me in that way. And if they can start talking about mistakes and how it makes them feel, if they can start talking about that sort of vulnerability and how they're learning from outside the norms, the traditions of learning, then these are all great things. But bold is a word you used,
Yeah.
and bold is definitely needed in that sort of setting.
Because like the failure of, oh, I really messed up and having that conversation is also, so reverse mentoring, I also hear it a lot within the DE&I space or within the digital space. And I hear quite a lot of, oh, he or she is going to teach me how to use the tools, going to teach me how to use Facebook or how to do social media. And it's so much more than that. If the reverse mentoring process is two-way, and if I'm willing to step back and accept that there's lots of things today that I really do not know, and that
Yeah.
I would like to learn, I need to learn, irrespective of how many years I've spent in the organization, leading big, small teams. It's that, I suppose it's humility, but
Yeah.
also the self-awareness to say, guess what? Humans are imperfect beings and completely fallible. And, there are always perspectives. No one ever has the same perspective 100%, which is why it's so interesting to talk to other people.
Yeah.
But I think, the whole busyness of, I don't need to know anything else. I just need you to show me how to do social media is hindering what the younger generation can bring. And therefore, to come back to one of your earlier points about how do we make them feel seen, heard, and valued? Because there is so much value in that massively different perspective. And I just think often it gets crossed over or intentionally just put aside. And that can be very, very demotivating for them.
Yeah, it can. I think the leaders that I see that do this well are those that follow something like Edgar Schein's work around
Yes.
humble leadership.
Yeah.
And, it isn't just show me the tools, but it's why is this important? And it's
Mm.
asking and being curious.
Mm.
All people, not necessarily just younger people, but just being curious in work about why is this working? Why do I need to be involved in this? What would I benefit? What would the company benefit? There's so many curious questions that leaders should be asking. And I think what gets lost is because leadership is as a result when we're in hierarchical systems, hierarchical structures. If you're very good at your job, your technical job, you've got technical brilliance. The only way to get more money or status is to be promoted, to be the manager of other people who are technically brilliant. And yet people skills and
Yeah.
technical skills are poles apart. So somebody who's a good leader, who's a good manager of other people, actually needs to invest in themselves in those people skills, not just rely on the fact they know how to do the technical job that the people under them are actually still doing. And this is one of the reasons why I advocate for flatter structures, because that technical brilliance isn't what gets you promoted or gets you more kudos or status. That emerges from the fact that you understand people, that you're curious, that you offer vulnerability, that you ask questions, all of those kind of approaches.
And those people, key influencers and people on the edges of systems a lot because the center isn't about that yet. They're always looking for new ways of doing things and just questioning, but I think they're also constantly sense making. And I think that's quite threatening maybe for the top of an organization who do sense making once a year when they do strategic objectives, because that's why I mean it's very black and white, but that's a lot what I see, and it's a lot what I lived in organizations is these people, you can see it in their head the way they're sense making, and it's all going back to this quest they have for peer learning or more agile organizations or flatter organizations. And self-empowered organizations for me are the way forward, but it's interesting because they've now been categorized and sort of put into buzzwords, and people are like, oh, it'd be great if we had a flatter organization. I won't have a boss and I can do what I want and this and that, and then and I can collaborate with who I want when I want. And I think ironically, it's harder to work in a flat organization or flatter organization than a sort of hierarchical one because the personal agency is very, very clear. You know, it's your accountability, it's your responsibility, it's your role to collaborate on this, 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 and this. And there are collective objectives. And it's interesting as practitioners, I think, to look at what you're seeing as to people who are going from pyramid to sort of ecosystem structures in terms of organ. I know your work covers also organizational
Mm.
design and everything that entails from a human perspective. So I'd be interested in hearing what you've seen in flat organizations since they've become a thing, if you like, you know, with Frederic Laloux and
Yeah.
Thiel and everything else.
So for me, if you take your old school thinking into a flat organization, it's never going to work. And
Yeah.
that's the same for everything. If you approach digital learning with your old school thinking, it's never going to work. This is the whole Henry Ford's faster horses.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, why invent the car? They just want faster horses. And this same thing happens. So when you put flat into an organization, you have to approach all aspects
Mm.
different. So you can't just say, who's going to tell me what to do? You need to put a mechanism in place. So you need to look at all parts of the system. And what I find really fascinating, really interesting is that, and this is a connection I've almost made on this podcast. Schools are teaching the skills we need for flat organizations. Schools are not teaching the skills we need for hierarchical organizations. Let me explain what I mean by that. So, in a flatter organization, you need to have discernment, you
Yeah.
need to have critical thinking skills, you need to understand cause and effect. And, you know, in a history lesson alone, you might have that. In a geography lesson, you know, when you're looking at coasts and rivers and how rivers form, you're
Yeah.
looking at cause and effect. And then when you take that into an organization, you know, you've got no manager. So if I take this action, what effects am I going to have on my colleagues?
Mm.
No one's going to
Mm.
tell me what to do. No one tells the river what to do.
No, but it finds a
Nature's
way.
there. Yeah, nature's there to find the way. And so this is it's almost come to me during this conversation, because actually when you take critical thinking skills into a hierarchical organization, you're not there to think. You're not there to criticize the people above you. You're not there to question, why are we doing it like we're doing it? And I am struck by how quickly young people coming into work are squashed.
Yeah.
They are sort of sucked into the system. So they stop questioning and they start worrying about getting to work on time and not taking too long a lunch break and being seen to be working more hours, because
Mm.
then they're more committed. All the things that don't serve the human race and don't serve work.
Yeah, but they're
So
fitting in, aren't they? They're trying to
yeah,
fit in as opposed to
they're
be
trying to blend
themselves.
in. But when you're fitting in to a flatter organization, it is about your contribution.
Mm.
And it's not about being seen, but it's about what you do, what you bring, what you think, what you share. And
Mm.
these are the skills that actually we're sort of hammering out of people when they enter
Mm.
the workforce. So
Yeah.
perhaps reverse what I said earlier, whereas education's not preparing us for work. Education's not preparing us for work in a hierarchical structure as it is today. But
Mm.
perhaps education has been preparing us for a work that we've needed for
Yeah.
a long time, but we don't have.
But it's not explicit, is it? They're not
Mm.
saying these are the skills of, I mean, I see, and thank you, digital, I think, for this, but I see a lot of systems thinking in younger people
Yeah.
because they are obliged, because of the way the world is interconnected, to start looking. I can see them connecting things
Yeah.
that create smaller systems. They're not stuck in one model. You know, they've got access to all this information. And I do think there are various sort of areas of dialogue that have been opened a little bit more. So
Mm.
they have conversation like when I discuss DE&I with my nieces and nephews who are between 14 and 17, it's like a very, very different discussion, refreshingly so. But
Yeah.
they're connecting things that
Yeah.
I never connected at that age. And I think, you know, I wanted to ask you about critical systems thinking because I know you take a holistic approach and so do I, and you know, we share our passion on that. But I truly believe that that's the only way that organizations can create structures that will keep them in a competitive advantage is to understand this flatter organization, which for me is thinking in systems as opposed to silos, my budget, my department, my, even talent rotation. It's like, well, you can have him or her for 3 months, but they're my talent. So then you have to give them back, so keeping them in a system that's all about ego,
Yeah.
as opposed to eco. And I'm just a little bit disappointed that systems thinking is becoming something now like compliance, where you have to do systems thinking training if you want to be a senior leader, which is true. But we're back to the way they learn that or not.
Yeah.
I'd be interested in your thoughts on that because I think that is a key thing for senior leadership moving forward if they want their organization to be like the river, adaptable, resilient, and able to manage any situation that emerges essentially.
I think the biggest eye opener I ever can offer to anybody in work currently is to just talk to them about traffic. And I know that sounds bizarre, but if you ask senior table, just, how do you feel about being in traffic? And 99% of people will feel frustrated, annoyed, late, anxious, that kind of thing. And then you start having a conversation about why is there traffic? And then they start digging into, well, there's not enough buses, or I can't take the train where I live, or I need to drop off my kid's dog granny on the way to somewhere. You are the traffic, you are the problem,
Mm.
and therefore you are the solution. And so I think it's exactly like you described. When you talk about systems thinking, when you teach systems thinking in a very static and abstract way, it's the same as if you teach compliance by policy.
Mm.
It doesn't feel relevant. You need to personalize the experience so people can really understand, how are they the traffic? How are they part of the system? Where are they in as a cog in the machine? Often organizations will, like you say, they'll look at their team, their department, their silo. They don't even think of their organization as a cog in a
No,
bigger
no,
machine,
bigger picture. Yeah.
the economy of a country, or the ecology of that country. And we're getting better over time, particularly looking at the sustainability angle, and that how the decisions that we make in a boardroom are
Yes.
affecting the world that we live in. But I also think that we need to sort of shift our view, because especially in the Western world, our view is really profit first,
Yeah.
and potentially somewhere, maybe planet might be in there. But for me, I follow the sort of the triple bottom line of definitely people first.
Mm.
When you start to approach work from that angle, then some of the decisions that you make are slightly different
Mm.
than if you're just looking at profit. And
Mm.
all of the evidence points towards the ease of friction in work being people first.
Mm.
Profit will follow.
Mm.
People will be successful, because if you are looking after your people, you're looking after the heart of your organization. Organizations don't exist without
About
people.
people. Yeah.
Culture doesn't exist without people. Learning doesn't happen without people questioning and being curious.
Mm. And I think it's interesting though, isn't it, around how that happens in organizations because I'm I'm hopeful that this won't happen, but I do ask myself the question, this discussion around regenerative models, whether it's economy, circular economy, regenerative, or we'll talk about regenerative leadership now, that it will become a buzzword, the regenerative. And I think that's exactly what is needed because sustainability has sort of gone down that path a little bit as well. And it's so important and it's at the heart of what people know how to do.
Yeah.
And for me, learning is a massive example of that and a massive opportunity for society in general. But let's talk about organizations to actually enable their people to transform and therefore transform or morph into what they need to be. If I look at the startup scene that changes so quickly and is changing the way economic models work, the way businesses work, the way we need to think about what we do in organizations. Um, it's interesting to look at what that might look like in the future because I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about the research that you're doing for your book and easing friction in the workplace because we do need some friction, don't we? Just like we need healthy challenge. And I think people are scared of actually taking that step of it's okay to create or to have friction.
Yeah, I mean, I've done my research, desk-based research, and then I've done a series of podcasts speaking to lots of different people to talk about friction in work, and the themes that are coming out are very clear, and the focus has got to be people.
Yeah.
Focus has got to be making life real. When you look at classical management theory, we separated life and work.
Yeah.
You were a machine almost in work, and the consequence of years, decades of classical management theory is huge mental health crises. Huge impact on our planet is people not daring to put their head above the parapet, because that employer is not just their employer, but it's the person that pays their mortgage, that pays their rent, that puts food on their table. And the conversations that we need to have in work, I think, need to be a lot more real. And so I'm going to take sustainability as an example. I always try and look at the intensely practical, that the conversation around sustainability, let's look at this from a learning perspective. Years ago, I've been in this game for long enough, we printed out our workbooks, and we all knew we would hand those workbooks over to people in our class, and those workbooks would go back to the office and go in a drawer and never be seen again. Now, that workbook was probably covered in a lovely, nice plastic laminate. Nobody dared say, nobody would sit in that class and go, don't give it to me, because I'm never going to look at it again. They would ease that friction by not having that conversation. And we would feel like we were doing our job because we'd given them a resource that they could take away. But actually, now what's happening is people are happy to say, I don't need the workbook, or have you got a digital version? But actually, digital isn't the answer either, because that workbook is sitting on a server somewhere, the same as we record our Teams meeting because Johnny couldn't turn up. That's sitting on a server somewhere. We need to get brave about raising the issues that really matter. And for learning, for example, you're right, do you need a cup?
Sorry, yeah, I'm fine now. Something's stuck in my throat.
Okay. We need to get brave at raising the issues that need to be discussed. And for me, sustainability is gladly gaining some traction now, that digital doesn't equal environmentally friendly, paper printed doesn't equal environmentally friendly, but let's have an honest conversation about what do we need. And actually, we don't need to keep that Teams meeting saved on a server for years to come. We need to keep it for a week and make sure that we put time in people's diaries, and we need to change the system so that learning is prioritized and not just something that people don't turn up to because they've got something better to do. So question everything, I guess, is my answer to all these things.
Question everything, and it's about changing habits, isn't it? Because Johnny might never go and look at that. He might say he has, he might not have time, he might decide that he doesn't need to, but it's also the sort of discipline of changing habits to think and act differently, I think. And that's the hardest thing for me. That's the biggest challenge we all have individually, but collectively, if I come back to fitting in and how you're seen and what you're seen to be doing, reading, which meeting you're sat in, what type of phone you have, what time you go for lunch and with who, and, the rest of Edgar Schein's assumptions, the assumptions of an organization and what that means. It's interesting to see how we can enable, because that doesn't habit forming. If Atomic Habits, where James Clear says, you've got to change the system. And I think it is changing the system, but one habit at a time. And that is hard and it takes a long time.
It's a really good book about this, Learning Habits.
Learning Habits. For those of you who are listening, Michelle's holding it up, and it's called Learning Habits by Sarah Nichol. Okay.
Yeah, it's a really interesting book. It's very easy to read. She's very clear on how she writes, and so there's a system to follow, which in a book I love, because we're all busy people and we don't have time to read 200 300 pages of a book, but the way Sarah writes is very accessible, and I think that that's a good one. There's another good book, she's looking on her bookcase, Susie Miller. Susie Miller's Designing Accessible Learning Content. I'm going to give that a shout out, and I'm holding that up as well. Designing Accessible Learning Content by Susie Miller is currently coming out in a second edition, as well as my own book coming out in a second edition in September. The reason I'm mentioning these is because fundamentally, when it comes to transformation, we do need to do things differently.
Yeah.
So there are experts out there that can help us to create new habits, and certainly Susie and Sarah are two of those. The opportunity for creating new habits, though, needs permission. It needs environment, and it needs culture, and those need leadership. So one of the chapters of my book addresses those three areas: the environment, permission, and culture that you need in order to create effective learning in your organization. Arguably, in my further research about friction in work, that is also what you need to ease friction.
Yes.
It's almost a leadership framework rather than just a learning framework. Because if people feel that they don't have permission to be curious, if they don't have permission to question, then they won't. Because you're paying their mortgage, you're paying their rent, you're putting food on their table. And these things are not unrelated.
No.
And so, yeah, to create new habits, we need to create space. I guess so that my final sort of shout out really is to Nancy Klein's work.
Yeah.
And her work on the thinking environment, because when we do better thinking, when we create an environment that people can think, we fundamentally do better work. And so these are the sort of things that I try to introduce to organizations that I work with in order to set them up for success.
I know, and I completely agree. And everybody always seems a little bit surprised. It's like, oh, it's simple. I want a complex model that I can deploy. And it's like, how could you create space in your head, and then in your team's mental space? How can you create that space so that they can learn differently, think differently, do differently? I think it's really interesting to look at how we've just put all types of methodologies that have different cognitive processes, like design thinking, innovation methodologies that I love for that very reason. And then we just shoehorn them into, right, you've got an hour to do this, and then we need to go and deliver that, and that. And it's like, whoa, okay, so how does that? It's a nice sort of breath of fresh air, but it's not changing a system to come back to systems thinking.
Well, that's actually that. Let's go back to that hangover from COVID. So one of the bad sides of COVID, I think, is meeting, sort of the way that people have meetings now. That will stick in back to back because they're online. We don't have to move from one meeting room to another. But actually, when we used to walk from one meeting to another meeting, that was our thinking time. That was our decompression. That was our processing time. And we don't have that now. How many people are having a 9 o'clock, a 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock? You get to 12 o'clock and you're like, well, when are we doing the work? Because meetings are the work. And so you need to do that thinking, you need to do that processing. So I really try to encourage walking meetings, for example, where it just softens and takes it slightly more relaxed. And you can do a walking meeting online. I'm on my phone, you're on your phone, and we're wandering wherever. And just stopping, pausing, that builds in that natural sort of that break. And it goes back to habits, because we've just got into the habit of a 9 o'clock, a 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. No, when do we have a coffee? When do we nip to the bathroom? All of the stuff that we could do when we were based in offices. And in an office environment, you might have 1 or 2 meetings a day. 3 if you're busy. No, we have 3 before lunch. It's just not quite right. So we need to reverse that habit, I think.
Whole different set of activities for the brain, isn't it? If you've got 3 meetings between 9 till 12, as opposed to 1 at 9, 1 at 1, and 1 at 3, for example.
Yeah.
And what's your vision? Time is running, but I would like to ask you, what's your vision for learning in the next 5 years, and how do you envisage your legacy in that? Because just for the listeners, before we came on the podcast, I was talking and reflecting back to Michelle that for me, she is an eco leader, so somebody who does collective leadership, who talks about collective leadership, and who embodies collective leadership. And I think that's a really important part, and I know it's an important part of your legacy. So it would be interesting to see what your vision is in the next 5 years and how you are going to continue contributing to that.
I personally don't know anything or everything. So I need other people around me to bounce ideas, much like we've done in this conversation. I've enjoyed every conversation we've ever had.
Likewise.
But in terms of vision, I would really like learning to embrace the sustainability agenda. I would like for us in organisations to just not pay lip service to it in the same way that we're starting now to pay lip service to DE&I, and that's not right.
No.
Some organisations are cutting budgets in that area, and again, that's not right. I would like us to be better at accessibility and personalisation of learning as a result of accessibility, so that people don't feel like they have to mask at work and be somebody they're not. And I think that we really need to look at mental health and the load that we're putting on people and the damage, the longer term damage that that's causing. And the expectation, for example, for us to fit our learning in during those 3 meetings in the morning, it's ridiculous and it's impossible. Productivity comes from good thinking. It's from people feeling comfortable and happy at work, and people feeling seen and heard. And those are the things that we need to focus on, I believe. And it really goes back to people first, always people first. The profit stuff will follow. The productivity stuff will follow if you focus on your people. So from the learning perspective, from an organization development perspective, the kind of work that I do, I always try and look at people first. And what that looks like on the ground, that would be having a conversation with questioning assumptions. So many times I'm brought in, Michelle, can you come and do a team building session for us? How do you know? That's the question I ask all the time. How do you know that that's the solution that you need? Have you spoken to the team? Can I speak to the team? So engage with those stakeholders, really understand what the problem is that you're trying to solve, identify what success looks like before you've even come up with the solution. Because if you can articulate that final, if this team was working well, what would it look like? Okay, we don't need team building. We just need some very honest conversations.
Yeah.
For example, I'm just trying to give you a sort of top of the head example of how does people first really manufacture in the real world.
I love that, because relationships for me are the currency of systems, and collaboration is about the quality of conversations that you are having, because you can collaborate with someone and never really get to the point that you need to get to, just small talking or discussing KPIs or whatever. So I think, and that's the hardest part of any collaborative organization or structure for me, is the quality of conversation. So, in terms of what people need to learn, I also think we need to get more honest about what we need to learn and what we need to put in leadership learning. I'm coming back to organizations, school is also, but what the leaders need to learn. They don't necessarily need to learn models of this and models of that. They need to experientially learn getting more comfortable with feeling uncomfortable. That for me is what leadership's about.
Laura Overton calls it cooperation and collaboration. Many of us cooperate.
Okay, interesting.
Don't collaborate. And I think it's a really nice, interesting lens to look at your relationships in work through. And so many of my learning colleagues might say, yeah, I talk to the learners. We get a survey at the end of every learning. That's not collaboration. That's just hearing, did they like the biscuits? Did they like the lunch? How easy to access was the digital experience? You're not actually collaborating with them. You're not building that solution alongside them. You're looking at the wrong end of the horse. You're looking really at the end when you should be starting together rather than ending together.
Excellent. I'm now torn, because I wanted to ask if you had a final call to action for our listeners, but I quite like that. But I'm going to anyway. Do you have a final call to action for our listeners?
I do. And I think you can listen to podcasts like this, which is brilliant. You can read the books that I've recommended. You could read my book, but none of those things are a substitute for your context. And I think that if anybody in work, anybody in people development, anyone in transformation or change, if you don't understand the context you're working in, if you can't talk the language of your business, then none of this is going to mean anything. You can get your great inspiration from whomever it might be in the model and whatever, but really understand, what does that land and look like in your organization? So the trend of generative AI, well, how can you use that in your setting? What's right for your organization? Follow the evidence and just ask yourself that question, how do you know? And if you can't answer that question, you don't know enough about your context. You need to keep digging for evidence. you need to keep asking people, having those quality conversations. So yeah, context.
Context is king. I'm gonna leave our listeners with that, with the looking at the model that works for them. Michelle, thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts, your research, your insight, and who you are. Where can people find out more about you, Kairos, and what you do?
So kairosmodernlearning.co.uk is my website. I'm on LinkedIn at Michelle Parry-Slater, so look me up there. Do tell me why or how you connected, because I liken LinkedIn to running into the street and just handing somebody your CV, unless there's actually a connection. So I like to know how people
Brilliant.
found you, and then we can start building a relationship, because relationships are really important.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for a great conversation.
Thank you.